All right, welcome to a new hour of the enhanced world of theories of growth and distribution. What we had done last hour on Monday is to give you a broad introduction about the idea of growth itself. And as I had indicated, if you recall, that growth is actually the very premise of our profession. And I have indicated that Adam Smith, in his magnum opus, where he opened up the floor for us for the economics as a profession some 250 plus years ago, the title of his book was An Inquiry into the Causes of Wealth of Nations. So from the very start, from its inception, economics has always been a science of change, dynamism, accumulation, and growth. The peculiar distinction of this particular course will be its emphasis together with issues of distribution. How output is distributed among functional categories of income: workers, peasants, landlords, capitalists, industrial versus finance capital, and of course the state, the queens and the kings. So more and more often I am going to highlight that how national product or how produce is to be redistributed will be a key to answer the question of how we produce in the first place. And depending on the kind of methodology and assumptions we develop for studying these questions, the role of distribution versus production and technology will have a very important task to assume. Now, we have seen this graph. Let me just highlight a few points and use this as a basis for our discussion today. As you will recall, this is data from Agnes Madison's Millennium contribution. On the vertical axis, we have 19 international fixed dollars worth of per capita income. And on the horizontal axis, we have time. Now, from the origins of our planet, of all humanity, back into the unhistorical ages, all the way to the time of our Lord, the Anno Domini, the birth of Christ and the beginning of time. Madison's data suggests that on average, and that's a big average, from sub-Saharan Africa, from Mesopotamia, all the way to the steppes of East Asia to England, an average human being on this planet is calculated to earn 400 US dollars, measured is in 1990 prices. And that was true for millennia and millennia after. The idea that since the days of Adam and Eve, they owned one apple and then they did a couple of inventions. They started producing, growing. They become richer and richer and richer until the days of the Industrial Revolution in UK. That is not true. For millennia and millennia, human beings on this planet were on a subsistence level of constant income. This does not mean that there were kings just enjoying big parties and there were poor slaves just dying out of hunger. I'm talking on a, as I said, big average. Okay? On average, human life on planet for a very long time was stagnant, fixed. Whoever was rich, whoever was poor. But despite a series of very important innovations, ideas, technological changes, revolutions like mathematics, metallurgy, the foundation of money, despite all these, nothing much had changed. And over here, a couple of ideas come to the forefront. And one of them, as I indicated on Monday, that is highlighted very much in the history of humankind, is the foundation of the decimal system, algebra, meaning using of force. It is the decimal system, arithmetics from today's vision, has become a powerful tool in adding and subtracting numbers. Not many people, neither in Europe nor Asia, neither in the Arab world back then, noticed its significance. But the first usage from our point of view has been the Venetians and the Genovians, the Italian city-states and the bankers. They realized that they can do commerce, buy and sell, and they can easily add and subtract numbers, even calculate concepts like the interest rate, the compounded interest rate, simple interest rate. There are incidences that had been taken place that the early Italian city-states bankers were, in terms of today's revolutionary financiers. Another very important development is Marco Polo's visit to China. Here I add a little bit of drama to the picture. The guy got the idea of sherbet that Mediterraneans had enjoyed, and he also brought pasta and spaghetti. As I said, Italians refute that in general, claiming that it was their invention and Marco Polo had only changed the texture of it. But from our point of view, what is important is the concept of paper money. And we are going to reinstate it in a moment. Now, when you look at this chart and the events leading to the rapid rise of per capita income, all of a sudden, at the turn of the millennium, reaching to something on the order of $5,500, $6,000, 1990 fixed prices, okay? That typically, we tend to argue that first, a scientific idea came into a bright man's mind. Einstein coming with the idea that E is equal to mc squared, or Newton discovering the laws of motion, that sort of a thing. And then this science is applied to technology, and after that, more output is produced. This doesn't turn out to be true. This is not a correct way of narrating this history of events. It is not necessarily true that first, a clever person historically came up with an idea, a scientific finding has taken place, and then that scientific finding had been applied to production, and voila, we are producing 10,000 t-shirts more. This is not a good realistic description, not even a caricature of what had happened. Most of the time, and there are very important exceptions to this story, innovators, merchants, entrepreneurs, through trial and error, by sheer luck, turn out to toy around with ideas to produce more, and most of the time, first they have accomplished something, and then a scientific inquiry had been implemented and understood what the scientific reason of it was. The most important story is Pasteur. He was working on the bacteria just to cure people without knowing what a bacteria is. He first come up with the medicine, and then the scientific observation from the medical profession had been provided. Another example is a guy named Lampert, who found out that if you heat food, meat, and then before cooling down, put it in a tight jar, then you can store cooked meat, in today's language, conserve, in tin cans, without the threat of getting it decayed. He realized that he can make money by storing products in tin cans, in a tightly stored cans. And he didn't know anything about, again, bacteria, diseases, the change in the nature of meat over time, worms or anything. It was almost 50 years later that his finding had been narrated by advances in science and technology. And even so, if it were true, that is, today's growth had been possible first by engineering scientific findings, then the burning question is, the engineers all around this millennia had been everyone but the British. In Hobsbawm's words, England, the education system, its scientific infrastructure, in Leo's terms, is a joke in poor taste. England had no education system. And you see this in the Victorian age films. It's typically a rich family, a private tutor is hired. The private tutor turns out to be the friend of the children. This is daily routine. There is no such a thing as mass education, as in France, for example, the polytechnics, or the German logic, philosophy, and art system, or the Austrians. That education leading to science has nothing to do with British lifestyle back in the 17th and 18th centuries. Therefore, all of these inventions played a cumulative role, but the fact that it had occurred in Britain in mid-19th century is one of the biggest puzzles of our kind. Why not in Islamic Arab societies who had mastered astronomy and physics of the time and mathematics, or philosophy and mathematics of the early Greeks, or before that the Egyptians who had mastered the delta of the Nile, had used the first ideas of geometry to find out the land system. None of these had accumulated enough knowledge to turn into an industrial revolution. Why? Why do you think? Why do you think it was the British who had succeeded in using the technology, mathematics, science, with something that was peculiar, that turned out to be, out of coincidence. I am not arguing by design that the British had almost invented participatory institutions, and institutions is the key to growth, or they have invented some new idea of transforming the society. No, things had happened by surprise and chance, I agree. But what is those things, you think? What is peculiar in the myth of the Industrial Revolution, unique to Britain and not anywhere else?
Statistics, maybe.
Okay, do you claim that they have better statisticians? Property rights, can you give a leading example of it? A statual example of the fact that rewards of entrepreneurship, that's what you are trying to say. Property rights, that is, rewards to an invention. I invent the light bulb. I invent the tin can, and I am going to reap the benefits of my invention or of my investment. What is unique, what had been unique in history, and a very long, deep history from Britain that you remember from History of Civilization classes, Hijivs? Magna Carta. Magna Carta is a classic example of establishment of the rule of law and guaranteeing returns to private ownership and private initiative. 2015, Magna Carta. I'm not going to over what it had enabled, but basically it enabled the fact that individuals had certain rights, like the tax rate, how much you are going to pay taxes, right to a claim to what you had produced, equal footing with the noble and among others. The restriction of the ruling classes' rights to exercise force and objections. That turned out to be particularly important. And the British geography, again, by chance perhaps, out of nature, by habit, by culture, by a certain anthropological events that I cannot claim expertise on, had developed a judiciary, a legal system to protect the rights of ownership and entrepreneurship. Before that, let me call as a second factor. Before that, I can claim something as the birth of the national mind. The Renaissance and the Reform movement. That is an enlightenment of rational thinking of cause and effect events. And to this day, Britain was not unique. It was an all-European event. And the Renaissance is claimed to have started in 1304, July 20 to be precise. That particular day, a philosopher in Rome, Patriarch, was born. His contribution to the human history was translation of old Greek and Egyptian, but mainly classical texts. The Pythagorean theorems, the tales, laws, work teachings of Aristotle, the Plato, the logic and philosophy and mathematics, if you will, had been reinvented by the Catholic Europe. The works had been translated into Latin. And many people argue, at least my colleagues in the history department, Mehmet Kalpaklı, Özer Hoca, the usual suspects, agree that Renaissance had begun with the accumulation of knowledge coming from the ancient Greek philosophers. But that's not unique to Britain, I agree. Something unique to the British. Yes, but how was steam founded and applied? To something entirely different.
Transportation.
Okay, transportation. What is behind transportation? With whom did British trade? Overseas trade. Colonialism. Who do you have in mind? India, Pakistan, Ottomans. We were embracing free trade like hell. British came and built the İzmir-Aydın Railroad because they loved us. No, because they loved our tobacco, our fig, and they realized that they can colonize the land and transport what they had from their colonies to London. Two very important observations. One, again, at the background, it seems the presence of a commercial-minded imperialistic setting. Ottomans had gone all the way to Vienna and taught Vienna how to cook croissants, how to make Turkish coffee, which turned into a Viennese. I'm slightly dramatizing the events, but British had a commercial-minded bureaucracy, working with a monopolized trade routes. Britain had never been a free trade enterprise. They were monopolistic from the very start, imposing free trade on others. Buyurun.
Give the example of the Golden Triangle of Africa, United Kingdom and USA.
You can. That is the seaway trade, the sea routes. Do you recall the colonialistic British company working overseas? Exactly. And can you visualize how trade was being conducted? In front is British naval ships with the guns and everything, and at the back coming the commercial ships, transporting back and forth, taking tobacco, raw materials, riches of the Asia and Africa, and returning back, what? Guns and people. And shirts. Manufacturers of the day. Colonialism has enabled UK two things. First, resources of the planet had been channeled to London, Liverpool, Manchester, the Bob Dylan's teams, the working houses of the planet back then. But in return, it had also provided a second, a very important opportunity. Markets. British, after all, a couple of million people, overproducing textiles and manufactured items. And those produce had to be sold. And it was sold to Ottoman houses, Asian castles, the emperor's weddings, so on and so forth. The British cloth has dominated the whole planet by workings of free trade. You must have taken Ricardo's idea of comparative advantage. What are the two examples David gives? Ricardo, it is David Ricardo. Britain sells what? Cloth. To whom? Portugal, typically. And what does Portugal have? Wine. British sells pantaloons. Portugal is supposedly has comparative advantage in the production of food, that is agricultural goods. And David argues for the repeal of corn laws. That is, agriculture should be free, so that we can buy agricultural products but sell cloth and manufactured products in return. It was his idea of imposing free trade, but free trade to the advantage of the British. How? With what we had seen in history, the Navigation Act. Do you recall this, or have you come across what Navigation Act is about? It is navigation law. It's a law supported by the Queen and implemented by the British naval force, the imperialistic force outright, claiming that all colonial trade between London and the colonies will be carried out by British ships carrying British flag. British is in competition with the Netherlands, the Dutch. They have also their own imperial objectives, and they are competing each other. And the British had the edge because it adds military and does not take any ship to the mainland that doesn't carry a British flag. So it had never been the idea of free competitive world. Sorry folks, we have been hiding this thing for the past 3 years in your careers, especially in the introduction to economics classes. That's the free markets had never been free in Britain. They were monopolistic, led, governed by a strategic purpose. I am not saying monopoly in a negative way. I want to observe that. It is where the monopoly rents had been secured, the monopoly profits had been maximized, and was ensured that they will not be dissipated among things of no use for technological development. These guys were serious. Okay. I spent 2 years in Izmir in 2012, and I had the opportunity of going and visiting the Sard temple and the Sard ruins. That's by Manisa. Have you ever been through that? This is the birth of the Lycian civilization, the first use of money. The rivers, the Sarp River, is rich in gold still. And there are old furnaces. They are burning, they used to be back in the prehistoric times, soil, and the gold ore is melting down. And Croesus is the richest man on planet back that time. And among the ruins, you can see, as I said, the furnaces, how gold was melted, where they fought their wars, how they lived happily then after, all the theaters and everything else. But as an economist, the most critical thing that I observed was the British. They came in the 1870s, 1890s, started excavating, and they built a railroad from Sarp all the way to Izmir harbor, late 19th century. And they have a crane, all dusty but working on steam power, still operational. And they laid it over here. It's a very funny feeling. You have the archaeological ruins dating 2000 BC and the British crane all in dust coming from 1890 or something. The next summer, I mean, this is a little bit over, but do something favorable for you. On your way to Bodrum, Kuşadası, Antalya, wherever your favorite spot is, spend half an hour there and take a picture of that crane. I will bring it to you. That was fascinating to me. British had built a railroad, maybe about 200 kilometers, all the way to the harbor, to transport figs, tobacco, and also the archaeological ruins, and carry it all the way to the British Museum, let's say borrowed from the Anatolian geography. So, one, two, three factors that came to my mind. Anything else that you may think of? I have also indicated money, fiat money, on Monday. Remember I said that industrial revolution is not an engineering problem. It's an economic issue. Your friends in industrial engineering or mechanical engineering, or better than that, construction engineering, has nothing to do with the industrial revolution. Industrial revolution is about design, production, and commerce. Shirts had been built and they had to be sold. And they were sold to the expanding middle classes, the Oliver Twist and all his cohorts, by money. And money came from Kubilai's China with the help of Marco Polo. First the Genevians and the Bank of England. Bank of England is not a historical coincidence. It is the end result and also the catalyst of the Industrial Revolution. It was the Bank of England's signature with paper money, backed by gold, I admit, but still paper, that had facilitated commerce and buying and selling in the market. Otherwise, markets could not have been developed. And again, by historical will, British had come up with the idea of central banking, and that's how they enabled the flourishing of the markets. Let me jump to now, in your notes, I have two pictures, and I want to go one by one. The next picture, this one, I have taken from a very widely used Introduction to Economics textbook. And I have just had a very poor scanning of it, so I apologize for the poor quality of my photocopying. But this is allegedly the typical property of a typical British family. And this is repeated for every country. Even I am sure there is one even for Turkey. It must contain whatever you think of we are typically consuming. Ayran, lahmacun, etc., etc. But here, look at what they have. The young woman of the house is a flute. Of course, merchandise of any sorts. Bicycles, cars, 5 o'clock tea equipment, definitely. This is what they have. And then, in contrast, I'm going to show you one of the most Orientalist pictures. This is the typical properties of a typical average Indian family. Well, a few pots. This must be rice or paddy of any sort. Not much of cars or anything, but there is a bicycle. Of course, they're icons. Can I ask you, what is the most common factor in between these two pictures? Thinking of everything, humans and goods. But, yes, but from these two pictures, I mean, something that attracted my attention, and I am a little bit more complicated. Be a little bit innovative. Okay, all right. Let me, I am leading you to offshore. Look at the faces of people. They're all happy. The Indians, I mean, they don't have much. But globalization is embracing everyone. They know that patience and obeying the law of the global capitalist system, they will one day become like British. In the interim, perhaps like Turks, like Greeks, and then through very rapid acceleration of growth and embracing technology and finance of globalization. As of yesterday, this has become a pseudo, that Trump is saying that there is no globalization anymore. Sorry, lads, that's you missed the train. But that is the kind of the message that derives from, when I was a student, from the books that I read. Development economics. It's all about expansion, growth, and always a recipe. If you do those things right, you will become one of them. And this is what I came to my mind. The things that you have to do right. When I was in the graduate school, all economic policy was get the prices right. That was the key buzzword. We are fine. And then recently, we had the institutions, the participatory, non-participatory, but institutions. Institutions is the most important thing. I am not saying that they are not important. I am not saying that price system has nothing to do. But this search for silver bullet, that is one key thing that will just solve the whole problems of underdevelopment and colonialism and poverty and impoverishment in India, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Vietnam. It has solved the problem of British already. That is, here is the recipe. Rational mind, property rights, legal system, trade, a strategic, let's say, trade policy. Yes, but the fact is, institutions and ideas, they say, are like a high-quality French wine. They are not transportable. What is good in one region of the world, let's say chaebols, the export-oriented big firms in Korea, turns out to be a disaster in somewhere else. What might be working in China today would have no applicability in a fairly sophisticated, industrially developed, middle-income developed country. Education, definitely. Climate, of course. Well, diseases, yes. Culture, behind everything. You cannot refute any one of these. But the fact that all of them are perhaps important, perhaps not equally, but they are important. But the problem is how to bring them together. Remarks? Observations? Anything you want to add? Ya şimdi kameraya çıkacağım, sesim duyulacak, akşam arkadaşlarım ne der falan. Please forget about these concerns. Okay, let me add a few more things before we depart that I believe will help your homework, which is due 2 weeks today as well. In your homework, recall, I wanted to check with you the University of Groningen's U of Groningen, and there the so-called pan-world tables data. I suggested to you that you open a new folder, call this my favorite class or my most important class in this semester, which is true, by the way. I don't want anything like econometrics, mathematics, or anything. This is the most important course that you are taking in your academic life, and I mean this. I sounded like the high school geography teachers. Bu ülkenin ırmaklarının nereden geçtiğini bilmeyen çocuk Türk çocuğu değildir. Açın bir defter. Coğrafya en önemli dersinizdir. Or a history teacher. Biz 4 nala geldik. Anyway. But this is an important course. Okay? That is, you are, please make this investment yourselves. Open up a new folder. Put the Excel data, which is downloadable in a couple of minutes. And then try to make graphs of this sort. I am not asking you to replicate this graph, but this is an idea to you on the things that you are asked to check. One thing is, the more open an economy is, the more affluent that economy will be. Trade will bring growth and higher income. So if you compile, each dot of these is a country observation. On the horizontal axis, I have imports plus exports divided by GDP, the trade share. In your homework, you can do this, or you can simply look at import to GDP or export to GDP. The number will be typically half of this thing, more or less. So, for example, Panama, Ghana is the most important, most open country as of this data, 2004. Malaysia, Thailand, China, not much open, but having rapid growth. And if you swallow this idea, what you would expect is a neat upward slope of numbers. Here and there perhaps a couple of outliers, but there should be an upward sloping where more trade brings higher rate of growth. When I was in the university, by sheer luck, I turned out to be a ÖÇP student of econometrics, which I hated the rest of my life. I didn't take any econometrics class when I was in the graduate school, except for just saving my macro thing. And whenever I need to learn something, I go to Hakan Berüment or Taner Hoca or Fatma Hoca. They tell me what to do, and I am surviving. This is my beginning and end of economic theory. I can, of course, use econometrics for my purposes. But whenever I do that, I do not think that you get much of a high R square for any regression that you can think of, running rate of growth of per capita income as an independent, as an dependent variable, and the volume of trade of roughly 200 countries out there. This doesn't seem to be an upward sloping clear picture. You can torture the data a little bit. By torturing, I mean that, well, these are outliers, well, so are these, and here is your, but I mean, that's not much of a science, but unfortunately, there is research of that sort as well. Real world is rich. It doesn't fit into bold statements like this. There are always exceptions that break the rule. There are always stories to be retold. But that's an important assessment, an important hypothesis that we had to check over and over again. Returns are not automatic. That is, you eliminate all the tariffs and make a free trade and sit on your lap and wait to grow rapidly. There is always an additional factor: institutions, legal system, prices, culture, property rights, whatever, that has to complement these hypotheses. This was important. Let me go over. It's in your lecture notes. You will just read through it. That is one of the examples when I said Britain had never been a free trade country. This is average tariff rates from Bayroch and Chang. The time of the Industrial Revolution. The tariff rates in UK, the highest in the relevant world. Only after the Industrial Revolution, Britain turns into a free trade country. Well, of course, you are the leading pack, and you have to sell your products. You have to impose free trade. But that is a demonstration of that thing. I have a similar figure of the government size. The size of the government is claimed to be negatively correlated with per capita growth. Therefore, you should expect a negative slope. Again, something else to check. But these are, as I said, important claims and hypotheses that development economists or policy makers are working upon to make conclusions. All right. In your handout that I do not have time today, and I want to start a new subject entirely on Monday, of a tabulation that I came across of different types of capitalism. Neoliberal, well, not anymore in the United States since as of yesterday, but the European, the East Asian, the tigers, foxes, dragons, the zoo of the world model, and the third world capitalism. I have put a couple of distinct features just to make you aware that there is not one type of growth across the globe since the Industrial Revolution. There had been different styles, different characterizations of economic machine moving over time. And being aware of these differences across, that's what we shall be doing throughout the rest of the course. Any questions? Any last minute? 90+1 editions. Okay. Well, thank you all.